review a review of upcoming Nature Vancouver events, and they're going in chronological order, a date order. On Saturday, November 23rd, a birding morning at Wasson Jetty. The jetty is one of the most reliable places in the region to find western grebe and brant geese, along with a variety of other waterfowl and shorebirds. Contact webmaster at NatureVancouver.ca to register and get the meeting location. On Thursday, November the 28th, starting at 7:30 in the evening, Peter Ballon will discuss sea otters on Vancouver Island and elephants and rhinoceroses in southern Africa. It's a hybrid meeting at both Hewitt Hall and online via Zoom. On Friday, November 29th, all birders are invited to a social gathering at Hewitt Hall at 7 p.m. Please register in advance with Kelvin, that's Kelvin, at NatureVancouver.ca. On Sunday, December the 1st, 9 o'clock in the morning until 12 o'clock noon, there will be a birding event. It's called Winter Raptors, Birding by Car in Pitt Meadows, making scheduled stops with short walks on trails. On Tuesday, December the 3rd, Nature Vancouver has its monthly board meeting. It goes from 7 till 9. If you want to attend and are not a board member, contact Adele Liu at treasurer@naturevancouver.ca. On Thursday, December the 5th, from 7:30 to 9 p.m. on Zoom, Derek Matthews of the Vancouver Avian Research Centre will speak on planning and creating a bird and wildlife-friendly garden. And finally, on Saturday, December the 14th, from 7 in the morning till 4:30 in the afternoon, which is sunrise to sunset, you can get involved in the 2024 Christmas Bird Count, which helps track long-term trends in Vancouver's bird populations and is part of the Audubon Society's Community Science Initiative. If you go to Nature Vancouver's calendar, you'll find more information, a lot of information, and you can find your area on a map. So now let me introduce tonight's speaker, Connor Wardrop. He is going to speak on mosses and related plants, who they are not, and how they live their lives. So Connor grew up in the Cowichan Valley on Vancouver Island, and he did his Bachelor of Science at UBC, choosing the Honours Plant Biology program. He knew nothing about mosses until he took a course at UBC where he became hooked. Something about, do you say bryophytes or bryophytes? Bryophytes clicked for him. He thinks they're some of the most beautiful and interesting organisms around, and they're almost always around. I've learned that. My tiny experience with moss on a wall. Sometimes it's not there, but it comes back as soon as it rains. He learned that mosses are bryophytes are intricate and diverse, and finds that thinking about life at their scale and pace is both captivating and important. He's currently doing his master's at UBC in botany. His thesis focuses on disentangling the relationships and species-level diversity within one genus of liverwort called Conocephalum. Is that right? Yeah. He spent some time this summer in Haida Gwaii conducting surveys for rare bryophytes. He was also able to visit a remote locality in northern BC where no one has collected bryophytes before. Field work is his favorite thing to do, but he also enjoys spending hours at the microscope and in the UBC herbarium where he is working. He will take specific questions as they occur, but let's save more general questions until the end. So over to you, Connor.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I'm just going to get the presentation started. Is that full screen for everyone now? Great. Yeah, thank you so much for that nice introduction. Yeah, my name's Connor. And yeah, just gonna give an introduction about the bryophyte world today. Bryophytes, they're not just mosses, but mosses are definitely what's representing them best, at least in the public eye. Um, so when we're actually talking about bryophytes, let's start off by, sorry, I'm just looking at my screen, thinking about where we are in the tree of life. So this is a tree of eukaryotic organisms, so things with a nucleus. This was actually made by a lab just down the hall from me, so I like to show it. And we're right at the bottom at that ape down there. And if we look at plants, they're right over there in that large clade. And so bryophytes are land plants, and there are actually three groups of them, liverworts, mosses, and hornworts. And so together with flowering plants, ferns, and stuff, that's all of our living land plants, or embryophyta, if you want to be fancy. So the three groups of bryophytes, we got our mosses, of course, liverworts, and our hornworts. I'm just going to start off by showing just kind of a few photos of some diversity, so we're all kind of familiar and maybe recognize some things. And then we're going to kind of go into some more details and stuff. So my initial little moss menagerie. Um, the moss on the left is quite a jumbo moss. If you look in our big maple forests and stuff, you see often those huge chunks, big clouds up in the trees. That's often this moss over here. And I wanted to put it next to this other moss, Seligeria, on the right side, because this is one of the teeniest tiny mosses. What you're seeing is very much only a few millimeters tall. They grow on limestone in shaded areas, but people often think about bryophytes as in small, but there's a whole category of small. There's a whole different level. So continuing on, you probably recognize maybe mosses as being quite feathery, like on the left. Sometimes they can also be quite nicely colored, like Imberbium on the right. They often have these stalks coming up. We'll talk about more about what those are, but those are called sporophytes. We'll put those in context a bit later, but it's kind of how the mosses make their babies get around. There's lots of diversity in leaf shapes and stuff. Some of them have these fancy white hair points and stuff at the end. Some of them just look like nice little rosettes and cups. Big group of mosses that maybe is the most useful to humans would be the sphagnum mosses, and these are also the bog mosses. Quite beautiful. That can be teeny tiny, only a few leafy plants per one stalk, or you can have a lot of little stalks and little plants and no real sporophytes, so it's gonna be there's a whole lot of variation. These are some other cute ones showing some forms. And then after this, we're going to look at a few liverworts also to kind of familiarize ourselves with what they look like. On the left, this is probably the most common liverwort in our forests, and you'll see it all over on mostly woody substrates. And on the right, you can see that some of their leaves can be quite a bit fancier than the average moss leaf, and they can be very finely dissected and hairy. These are two of our most common as well on trees, liverworts. They're in the genus Perella. And I think these two kind of highlight where one of the common names for liverwort, scale mosses, you can kind of see it. They kind of look shingled almost in their leaves. And that's something that will pretty reliably distinguish them from mosses, but not always. We'll get into that. Liverworts, some people only realize that liverworts are these thalloid ones. Marcantia on the left is maybe familiar to you from like being a weed in a greenhouse or landscaping and stuff. And the plant on the right that's the genus that I study, Connocephalum. So what I study is in the same group as maybe the plants that are weeds in your greenhouse or plant pots. But something really interesting about it is I can't tell you what species it is. On the left, I can tell you that it's Marcantia polymorpha, and I can even tell you what subspecies. But on the right, we still don't know, and I'm figuring that out for my project. So this is a photo of a plant from Garibaldi, the region, actually, and it seems I just actually kind of got some evidence about it previously that it's much more related to a group that we only know from Russia and Japan so far. So it's kind of a new interesting thing. And I'm unsure if it's a new species within that group or the same species, but looking to figure it out. And there's a few more like that. But here's some other photos of thalloid liverworts, and you can see that they sometimes have these really cool stalks that come up, and then they have little sporophytes in there to make their spores. Really quite beautiful. They're often fairly small. Those last ones are kind of called complex thalloids, and then in contrast to that, these ones would be simple thalloids, and they're just kind of look a lot simpler. They're kind of like more lettucey. And the one on the right, Peleonesiana, that's quite common in our area in wet spots and stuff. So if you see kind of like little green lettucey looking goopy scales, it's probably that guy. But again, they're not all thalloid. Thalloid is when they don't have a stem and leaves, and some of them do have stems and leaves. Some of those leaves are actually super complicated, like the one on the left there, Pleurosia. Its leaves are like they're folded inwards and they make this crazy chamber that holds onto water. And it's thought that that species there on the left might be carnivorous, and it lives in bogs like a lot of other carnivorous plants. So you'll often see it right next to like sundews or butterworts and stuff. It's a wonderful plant. So the third group is maybe what most people haven't heard about, and these are hornworts, and they're also just kind of the most obscure and poorly represented bryophytes in general, especially in our region. But they have, instead of those stalks with kind of like a capsule at the end to release spores, they have their namesake, these horns, and they kind of release their spores at that blackening later on. There's not as much diversity within the hornwort body plan as there are in the other two groups, but they're pretty cool. They're all thalloid like this. So lichens. Lichens often get grouped in with bryophytes, so bryophytes being mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. But we know that these aren't actually plants. These are fungi predominantly. One sec, we'll get to that. But they are definitely allied with bryophytes, not in relationship, but in spirit and in habit. So they have a similar lifestyle and kind of similar strategy of living on surfaces and letting water kind of passively go in and out of their bodies. But as I said before, they're in this fungal group, the dicarians, and if you kind of trace back those lines, that's actually quite a lot more related to our ape than to our plants. So lichens more related to us than they are to bryophytes, even though they live quite similarly to bryophytes. So, of course, though, a lichen is not just the fungus itself. Fungus is what's making most of the body, but it has often different bacterias, and these can be from those two lineages down there, trabuxiophytes and chlorophytes, or even bacteria in cyanobacteria. So they'll house those, they'll photosynthesize for them, and stuff like that. So it's a big, complicated partnership. And there's a huge diversity in lichens. I'm not going to talk about them too much because, you know, I'm not an expert on them, but once you start getting into bryophytes, you'll run into all sorts of beautiful lichens on your journey and vice versa. So bryologists and lichenologists are often very, very good friends and will have a similarly very slow walk through the forest. Compared to liverworts, they can also be thalloid, but the thalli, kind of bodies, little flaps of lichens are often quite a bit larger, like in the middle, and they're quite a bit more diverse in form. a huge group of lichens that you'll probably encounter a lot are in the genus Cladonia. And so these are kind of your pixie cups and things like that. Also your reindeer lichens. And this is kind of one of those groups of organisms where once you start learning it, you'll see it. You'll start recognizing them and you'll be like, oh, that's probably a Cladonia lichen. And so you won't confuse them with bryophytes and stuff. But I just wanted to give you a little image of compare and contrast. So now back to bryophytes themselves, those three groups, some things that unite them. And I'm not going to break it down into these three groups, but they're kind of under these three umbrellas of morphological features. They have similar life cycles, and they all have the similar habit of being surface dwellers. And so they're not in the substrate like most vascular plants, but just on. So if we imagine just your average bryophyte will probably be, we're going to use Nephotricum elongatum as an example. And your average bryophyte will be a colony of many little different shoots. And most of these shoots will be green and photosynthetic. So that's how they're making their life is they're sitting there collecting sunlight, turning it into sugars and growing. And so these green leafy plants are also, when they're ready, going to develop eggs and sperm, just like a lot of life out there. Of course, not all of them are like stem and leaves, and kind of the alternate would be just kind of this ribbon or this strap. And so we call those thalloid, which I've kind of referred to previously, but that might be a new word. We also use the word thallus when talking about seaweeds and stuff often, when they're less, because they're also not really that often of a stem and leaves coming off of it. So these shoots, they don't have any roots, but they have other attachment points. They have threads that are like a single cell after a single cell, so very thin little hairs, and they're called rhizoids. And that's kind of an example on the right. So they're often brown, and they look kind of just like felt on the plants, and sometimes they can extend off, but these are mostly anchoring structures, and they can help with water absorption, kind of like a sponge or like a piece of felt or something. But oftentimes they're mostly there to kind of cement them onto their substrate or have them, grow. If you're in soil, you might want to attach to the few bits of rocks or things around you and stabilize. Inside the actual stems, they are often called nonvascular plants, and I'll probably call them that at some point. It's slight misnomer because they have slight vascular systems, but it's really nothing like our vascular plants. So anything that's not bryophytes, things like ferns and flowering plants and stuff. So about as fancy as it gets in a bryophyte stem is on the right there. Most of the times it just kind of looks like on the left where they might have a few cells right in the middle that are kind of specialized for being more efficient at conducting water. But in bryophytes, most of the time, water is conducted actually on the outside of their bodies and just pulled up around and then diffused inwards, rather than all of it being absorbed from the bottom and being transferred through the plant, which is quite like what vascular plants do. I'm going to talk more about that, so I won't go too much into it right now, but it's just kind of a comparison on the left. On the left is like just a twig of a vascular plant, so elderberry, and that is just in contrast with about the fanciest and most differentiated of our bryophytes, which would be this polytrichum stem over here. So not quite the same deal. If you look at on the left, each of those bundles has quite a bit of differentiation of different tissues, and that's quite a conserved trait in vascular plants. And so that's when people refer to non-vascular, aka bryophytes, and vascular plants, everything else, that's kind of the gist that they're getting at. So same goes for the thalloid ones. They don't have big water conducting tissues throughout their bodies, and oftentimes they're just kind of a mix of cells. The plant that I study, Connocephalum, some of the species have, if you do a section like this, you'll see big holes through the middle. And those are big holes that are canals through the plant that are just full of slime. And the slime probably helps them stay hydrated. But one of the wonderful things about Connocephalum is that it smells very strongly. And so there's a lot of very aromatic oils and compounds in them when you touch them. Anyways. For their leaves, for mosses and the liverworts that have them. So there's a lot of liverworts that are just thalloid, but there even more have stems and leaves like mosses. Almost all of the leaves are going to be just one cell thick, except for if they have a mid-rib running down there. Some of our like desert-y bryophytes, or some that grow in like really hardcore environments, sometimes they'll have a few layers of cells and even more ornamentation on top and stuff to protect them. But pretty generally, they're only one layer of cells thick. And so they're really good at absorbing and losing water really quickly. They come in a ton of different leaf shapes. And with bryophytes, it's not only variation in the overall shape that we also look about, but in the cell network and stuff too. There's a crazy amount of really cool, beautiful, intricate variation. And you can kind of see adaptations to different environments at that microscopical level of the shape of the cells and stuff. It's really neat. The bottom two, like the leaf in the middle, is from a liverwort, and the bottom right photo is of a liverwort for context. Leafy liverworts will often have those two leaves on the side and one row under the bottom, like what you're seeing. So a big exception to the one cell thick leaves is this group called Polytrichales. And you might be familiar with some mosses in this group, like Polytrichum juniperinum or something like that. They're often called haircap mosses. But these do very much their own thing. And they have a leaf like this with a bunch of vertical flaps on top. And so it kind of creates, if you look at a vascular plant leaf in cross section, there's definitely certain parallels between them of them creating this nice little kind of greenhouse space for those photosynthesizing cells. So in the image with kind of teeth on the sides of the leaf, that's showing you the lines running down. Those are the flaps sticking up. And then the two little half moon things are on the right is if we took just a few cell cross section and flipped it over and looked at it, that's what we would be seeing. And it's a little tricky, but often those cross sections in bryophytes are very informative and tell us how to do things, tell them apart. So a familiar thing about bryophytes maybe is that they make spores, so they don't have any flowers, they don't have any cones or seeds or anything like that. And there's quite a bit of variation in spores depending on what environment the bryophyte's from and maybe how far the spore is destined to travel, or if it's supposed to stick to something like a organism. Yeah, there's lots of variation. The spore-producing plant is that little stalk with the capsule at the top. And this is a whole different stage that we call the sporophyte, in contrast to the leafy stage at the that we've been talking about previously, which is called the gametophyte. These terms are a little convoluted, but hopefully you'll see the thread of why I'm bringing them up. But don't worry too much about it. It's called the gametophyte because it makes sperm and egg, which are called gametes. And the sporophyte's called the sporophyte because it makes spores. But something really unique about the bryophytes compared to all other groups of land plants is that the sporophyte grows on and is completely dependent and is fed by this leafy gametophyte. And the sporophyte itself only has one capsule, one sporangium to make spores in. So if we look at some other groups of spore-producing plants, like ferns and lycophytes and horsetails, these whole structures themselves are actually the sporophytes, the leafy plants. And so compared to the bryophyte, where it's just that stalk with a one capsule, makes the spores, it's completely dependent on the other leafy plant, on the other green plant. In ferns and horsetails and stuff, the sporophyte is actually the leafy dominant plant. And so it's kind of reversed. the plant that makes the gametes is this really small little one, and in the plant that makes the spores is the large photosynthetic one. And so that's kind of the opposite from bryophytes. And that's a really interesting quirk of their evolution that makes it really kind of hard to put context around it. And it's been interpreted in various ways, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. But you can see that also these sporophytes here, like a fern frond, it's covered in little sporangia. And that contrasts like our bryophytes, which only have one sporangium, one case per little stalk. So,
Can I ask a quick question?
yeah.
John Martin is saying, is there variation in spore colors as with fungi spores? Can you use this for identification?
Yes, you definitely can. In most groups of bryophytes, the size and surface ornamentation of the spores is the most diagnostic. But in groups like liverworts and some thalloid liver, in hornworts and particularly, and some thalloid liverworts, there's major splits in groups depending on spore color. So in hornworts, yellow versus black spores is quite a big division in the evolutionary history of the plants. Yeah, so they can be quite helpful. Not always though. So we're gonna just look at some life cycles, and on the left, this is of the fern, and I just wanted to bring this up to kind of contrast a little bit with what I was talking about before, where if you look on the left of the fern diagram, that's the sporophyte. Those leafy fronds, they have sporangia on them, and those release the spores. When the spores germinate in a fern, they make a small little gametophyte. Those make sperm and egg, and then a big sporophyte grows again. In bryophytes, you have this gametophyte. It grows from the spores, except for compared to ferns, it grows into the dominant life stage. And it grows and it gets photosynthesizes, it gets all that stuff, and then it makes sperm and egg, and it makes a small little sporophyte that grows on top of it. So again, it's kind of just the opposite. Might be a little confusing, but hopefully it'll make sense at a certain point. So if you're looking at the life cycle of a bryophyte, they need, like us, sperm and eggs to be united to make a zygote and make the next offspring. So when sperm and eggs are united, what actually happens is the sporophyte grows, and then that makes the spores. But to have the sperm connect to the egg is often quite a feat, especially if you're a small little plant. Some of the plants, they'll just make both of them on the same shoot and they'll go with themselves. Oftentimes, they're on separate plants, and so there needs to be some sort of travel, some way for the sperm to get to a separate plant. And this has to be done through a film of water somehow. The sperm, they swim as well, so they need some water. And often, a adaptation to help that is making a splash cup or a platform. So if you look at all the things on the right, those little kind of flower heads or stars, in the center of them are a bunch of little bubbles that are holding sperm. And so if you imagine a raindrop landing on one of those bubbles, when landing on the top there, those sperm can be released into that rain droplet. And then the next time a droplet connects, it'll push that away and it'll go around to hopefully land on another plant. So it's always kind of miraculous to me seeing sporophytes, because every time you see one of those stalks, it means a sperm and an egg found their way united, these tiny little structures out here from these tiny little plants. So when you often see mosses that have these little flowery tops, it's often the male plants that are trying to splash their sperm around. So about the gametophyte and sporophyte and how that compares to plants that don't make spores, it's even more different. So seed plants, you almost never really see the actual gametophyte, and it's so tiny reduced. Whenever you're looking at the average plant, you're looking at the sporophyte, except for in a moss. And In flowering plants and stuff and seed plants, the gametophyte is actually reduced so small that it forms the pollen grain. A pollen grain is actually a microgametophyte, and the other gametophyte is the spore mother cell that will go to make the seed in the fruit. So it's quite different, and you can see that among major groups of plants, there's been a progressive reduction in the gametophyte or expansion in the sporophyte. And so this has been quite a large scheme for how we think about the evolution of major groups of plants. And I'm going to kind of talk about some of the implications of it and why it may have led us astray in a few slides and stuff. So yeah. When a spore of a moss or most bryophytes germinates, it doesn't go straight into making these leafy plants. It oftentimes starts off by making this network called a protonema. So proto is first and nema is thread. So it's the first thread that comes out of a spore. And these kind of work like a little alga or something to cover a surface. And then once they've covered the surface and it's conducive to their growth, they'll make little buds, and those buds will grow into plants. So this is one of the reasons why it's kind of hard to tell what an individual is when you're talking about a bryophyte, is because you can have one spore that'll germinate and it'll make 5 shoots, and if another spore germinates nearby and it makes another 5 shoots, you have a cluster that came from two individuals, but it's a whole mixed colony. So it's really different thinking about how bryophytes work and what is an individual compared to saying, oh, that's a one tree, right? It's an individual. On the bottom right there is this is the result. I grew some spores on a Petri plate. And so that fuzz is a mix of this protonema, this first photosynthetic thread, and also rhizoids that come off of it. And then the little kind of clusters are the leafy shoots coming up. So putting that in the context of them and their ecosystems, they often form these huge mats, right? If you look on the left, we could choose to say just one of those shoots is an individual, but when you zoom out, it's so hard to tell. Is each one of those an individual? Did they all come from the same or not? So we think about bryophytes predominantly at the population or colony scale, and I don't know. I think it's quite a endearing part about them that makes them a little mysterious. So similarly, it's hard to determine the age of bryophytes. I have the photo on the left there of Sphagnum austinii. It's along our coast. It's really common in bogs, especially the northern coast. And this is from the northern Haida where it makes these huge hummocks. And it's torn open here because a lot of insects, particularly ants and stuff, like to live in these hummocks. And so bears sometimes will tear them open and eat stuff out of it. But I wanted to show you because it's kind of like a cross section of these hummocks that grow over time. And if you could kind of continually go down into this hole if you wanted, and the shoots would continually go. But they're not all, at a certain point, they're decayed enough that they separate. So you can't choose 2 shoots that are the same necessarily, and they decay from the bottom and grow from the top. So it's really hard to get an accurate dating on that when it's kind of moving. One of the easier examples that we might know about is steppe moss, so Hylocomium splendens. It actually makes yearly steps, so we can kind of look at it and count how many years it makes, and that's some bryophytes do that where they kind of make yearly steps, but a lot don't. If you look at the middle, that shoot is probably about 10, 11 years old. But once again, the problem is that these shoots, they continually grow and branch from the top, but also continually decay from the bottom. If you imagine a huge pile of these feathers, as long as the growth points aren't dying, they're continually growing and they're making they're weaving together and they're making this big cloud. But at the bottom, they're also decaying. There's fungi growing and stuff. And if you have that rate at the bottom be really slow, that's basically what makes a bog. So you have a lot of bryophyte growth on top, specifically sphagnum, and very low decomposition, and it just presses it, and that's anyways. But I'm not going into that too much, but perhaps we all know the wonders of bogs and how they're formed. So a big thing with bryophytes is their water relations, and there's this kind of fancy word called poikilohydry. And bryophytes are often said to be that, poikilohydric, and that's basically a complete alternative to water storage and conduction. And so vascular plants, like if you imagine a tree, it's getting its water through the roots, it's sucking it up, and then at its leaves, it's controlling the release of water very, very carefully, depending on its environment. If it's really dry and water is scarce, it's going to hold on to its water a lot more. If its internal tissues lose water, they'll collapse and the plant will die. It won't be able to recover. That's pretty much how most vascular plants work, and that's quite the opposite of bryophytes. They just dry out and tolerate it and then rehydrate really quickly. So they don't hold water so much inside. And so this goes back to most of their conduction of water is external, and so it fills up their shoots. So hopefully I'll be able to play this video of it's just me rehydrating a shoot, so you can hopefully see how fast it goes. But so this is in real time. This plant, I had it dry for probably 2 years or so away from sunlight in a paper packet. And then within 20 seconds, these curled leaves are all ready to go. And so not many things will just rehydrate that fast when you put it on it. There's all these adaptations on the leaves, like little bumps and channels that help guide the water and pull them through capillary spaces, as well as in between the leaves. So there's really sophisticated water conduction, but it's very different. So some implications or some things about this type of lifestyle of not holding on to your water is you can't photosynthesize when you're not in a humid environment. So you can't store water for later use and expend it when you don't have it available. And so you basically go dormant. And if you look at the top left photo there, that's a desert moss called Centrichia canninervis. And so this moss will spend most of its life in the dormant state. And it'll just, when there's a few years of growth, a few weeks of moisture proper, it'll hydrate. In the desert rains, it'll just bounce up so quick, and it'll take advantage of all of those periodic but rare rains. They took this moss, the species, scientists, and once they dried it out and then they exposed it to all the like the radiations and temperatures and all the extremes that we would expect and have calculated for the Mars surface. So they exposed it to that for 2 weeks, I think, or maybe 10 days or something, took it out and then rehydrated it, and it just started growing happily. So they're super tough little guys. And this process of just losing your water, if you can tolerate it, that's a pretty good strategy. So places that are wet and humid and therefore shady and stuff, just as a result of having all this water that's just available, they're going to be generally more suitable to bryophyte growth. And so you'll see a lot of the abundance and exuberance in these wet places. But anywhere there's water enough and a surface, you can probably get a bryophyte. So about living on a surface, there's this layer basically on every surface of little bit of still air. And so, sorry, let me rephrase. Because water, if you imagine air currents like water, it's easier to see that if they touch a surface, there'll be some drag on it. And as that drag kind of compounds once you have friction, that means that the air moving further away from the surface is going to be moving faster and more turbulent than the air close to a surface. And so once that kind of compounds, there's this strip, it's called the boundary layer, on every surface where the air is a lot more still, and so therefore it's more humid, there's more CO2, and there's less challenges of evaporation from whipping air going by. So bryophytes live in the boundary space. If you've read this wonderful book called Gathering Moss, it's by Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's just a fantastic bryologist. I highly recommend you read it if you don't. That little diagram is from her book there. And she talks about this concept in I find a way that makes a lot of sense to me, where if you're imagining yourself standing in the prairies or something like that, where there's a bunch of grass and it's kind of at waist high and there's big winds. If you're standing up, you're feeling those winds all hitting your body. And as you crouch down, it starts to get less and less. And if you go under the canopy of the grasses and wheat and stuff, you won't feel much of the wind at all. And that's because you're in the boundary layer that's provided by that. So if you're able to, as a moss, find the boundary layer of a surface, that's a pretty great little site for you to live. And so that's why we see that mosses live on surfaces all over the place as well. They anchor themselves there with their rhizoids oftentimes, and they don't want to be stick too far off the surface, because unless you're in the boundary layer, you're going to lose water a lot faster. But of course, there's tons of differences between surfaces. It's not just the boundary layer that these bryophytes are caring about. They can sense tiny differences, maybe even more than you and I, right? And so in seasonal, there's tons of variation in the different habitats they can occupy. So not all rocks are rocks. And the climate or seasonal water regime that we might be able to try and look at, being like, oh, water falls down here, how that compounds over time really dictates where these bryophytes and the species grow. So from harsh deserts kind of thing to just permanently seeped rocks in Haida Gwaii, you got a whole bunch of different communities. Oh, wrong way. Some of the interesting surfaces, you may have encountered moss on your roof or things like that. I thought this one on the car was kind of funny. That's pretty crazy. It's just growing on like the enamel or whatever that's painted over metal. That's probably rust. That's wild to me. But in the tropics particularly, you can have them grow on top of like the leaves of other plants. You often see them on the trunks of trees. Some of the interesting ones there's some groups that grow on bones, that nitrogen, somehow it does some goods for them. And one of the most loved groups of mosses by bryologists are colloquially called the poop mosses, because yes, they grow on poop only. And they grow on herbivore dung, generally in more northern and boggier places. And they have wonderful adaptations to attract flies to them and maintain and get themselves to the right spot. So if you look on the right of the screen, there's this kind of umbrella-looking thing, and that's the sporophyte. No other group of bryophytes makes this umbrella structure, but this umbrella structure, it kind of releases even more smells similar to the poop. And it's also there to catch the spores when they fall from the top, from that little capsule thing at the top. And so it'll attract flies who are already coming for the poop. And then they're like, oh, what's this? So they'll come up top, walk around. The spores are different and sticky, so they'll stick to the flies. And then the next time they find an uncolonized patch of poop and they start doing their thing, they'll deposit the spores and it can do its whole life cycle again. So it's super interesting to think about. And it's also kind of a chicken or the egg story for me of like, did the flies did they start attracting the flies first and then that's why they're only on poop, or did they join on poop before, and now the flies just continually bring them there. Anyways, it's super interesting, and they're always very exciting to find out in the field.
Hey, Connor, what was the name of that umbrella shape?
The umbrella shape, it's called umbelliform, I think, but it's like on the apophysis of the sporangium.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it's in the group called Splachnales or Splachnum.
Okay.
Yeah, they're super cool.
Yeah.
So a note on the small stature of a lot of bryophytes. Because they occupy these sites, they live on surfaces and in the boundary layer. There's not much like benefit to being too big. It's actually a detriment based on the niches that they're able to occupy and flourish. It would be a detriment to become too large. And you wouldn't be as efficient and stuff, which is kind of interesting because lots of times people see, you know, like size or visual, like perceived complexity in terms of success, but you can be the smallest little plant and accomplish all your same life cycle and stuff as these huge plants that take over time. It's just all about what niche you're fitting. And so bryophytes, I wouldn't say that they're small because they don't have the vascular system, they don't have the stuff that vascular plants have to get them big. It's just that they don't really need to. The space that they occupy doesn't favor that. And so you can see kind of crosses over between that with vascular plants and bryophytes, where some flowering plants, like they're tiny. If they live in the alpine and they need to adapt to their environment, it's unfavorable for them to be huge, similar to bryophytes. But also, bryophytes are often small at the scale of shoots and leaves and stuff. And the sum of those parts can be pretty fundamental. If you look on the right, that's just like basically a whole tree is covered by this shaggy, wonderful mat of this liverwort called Herbertus duncus. Super common along our BC coast. And then that bottom image, the larger one, it's not the best, but it's showing an island, like a floating island that is completely made of sphagnum moss. So this moss is kind of woven together and plants subsequently grow in it and spread their roots around it. And it's this island that floats. It's not anchored, it's not rooted into anything, but these tiny little one shoot, right, like size of my finger, makes these islands that are floating around and completely transforming the ecosystem. So back to the relationships of bryophytes to each other and to vascular plants. Where do we put the common ancestor? This is a very hotly debated and flip-flopped answer, but I think it's really an important thing to consider when we think about mosses and how we contextualize them. So one of the more classical concepts, and people still believe this today, is that liverworts are the first group of plants to branch off, and so they're probably the oldest distinct, and then we had this grade of then mosses split off, then hornwort split off, then lycophyte split off kind of thing. It could be possible. It's probably the historically most favored answer, and that's largely because liverworts have the simplest sporophytes. So if we're imagining that as we progress, the sporophytes are getting more complicated, and that's a driving force in evolution, you would probably put the liverworts at the bottom. But another more favored probably than that is putting mosses and liverworts more closely related to each other, and then those everything else related to that. This is largely based on the fact that these are the two groups that have sporophytes that have just a stalk and one capsule at the top, and so we can group them by that structure even though they're quite different. The third option for kind of their order would be that all bryophytes are more related to each other and all vascular plants are more related to each other. And there was this initial split between the two groups. And so we call that monophyly, basically, where all the descendants are from one point. And so this would mean that all vascular plants have a common ancestor, all bryophytes have a common ancestor, and those together share the ancestor. And so this is probably the most favored at the moment. It's still uncertain and we're figuring things out. And there's only, I think it's still maybe unpublished, but there's the most recent study to kind of look at this with big scale, looking at genes and stuff, found most support for this. And why I bring this up is because this has quite a big implication for how we think about bryophytes and small plants in general, is that if we put the common ancestor here, this means that there's essentially two ways of being a plant. There's the vascular plant lineage that's spread and diversified, and the bryophyte plant lineage that's spread and diversified, and that the bryophytes aren't inherently ancestral to the other ones. It's not like first we had liverworts, a group of liverworts evolved into mosses, a group of mosses evolved into hornworts. It's more that we have these two groups that spread each. And so it's classically bryophytes are called primitive plants or early plants or like not I can't remember. There's some old-timey word that is like very dismissive. But anyways, but this might not actually be the case. And so I don't know how much time I have, but I'm going to skim through the Paleozoic just to think about contextualizing bryophytes and their evolution. So tons of stuff happened in these periods. I'm not a paleontologist, so I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but I've just highlighted a few things in plant evolution that are interesting from the fossil record and kind of to contextualize things. So we'll start on the left with the Cambrian. And this period is kind of starting when multicellular life is getting going. That's kind of what we think about it. And then over the Cambrian, you've probably heard of the Cambrian explosion. There's just like a huge, crazy diversity of animals just getting going in the ocean, mostly mollusks and arthropods. But it's also thought that at some point during this period, we have the ancestor to all land plants. Even as early at this point, splits in arthropods have already happened, like arachnids are already a distinct lineage, which is wild. Once we get to the Ordovician, that's in the middle, this is the oldest period where we have fossil evidence of land plants. And these are just fragments, and these are fragments of spores and the casings of spores. And these have variously been attributed to, oh, they must have been bryophytes, or they can only be said that they're an ancestral plant, which makes sense. Another point of evidence is at this point, from rocks, we can start seeing the evidence of glomeromycete fungi, which are some of the earliest groups of fungi to partner with plants. And so seeing their presence coinciding with the first evidence of plants kind of gets this idea that maybe plants were starting to colonize during this period. Of course, there's at this point quite a diverse marine community. We have red and green algae. Brown algae is probably later on. But it's also thought that by this point we have the split between our three major bryophyte groups kind of near the end at some point, and that's largely based on molecular clocks of kind of working our way back of when this is most likely. Now, there's something I wrote there called Sphagnum Almost As We Know It, and that's because there's these fossils, I think they're from Wisconsin, that were found a few years ago, and within them they dated these rocks to this period, the Ordovician, and there was fragments of sphagnum leaves and stems in the rocks. And those stems and leaves, we can't attribute that, we don't know that structure anywhere except for in the modern day genus Sphagnum. And so it's pretty wild to think about. I can't tell you if that's perfectly, like they did everything right or whatever, but it seems pretty cool. And paleobotanists are like, that's wild, that completely would change the estimate. So I thought I would bring it up because it's pretty interesting. In the Silurian, we end the Ordovician and start the Silurian with kind of this big mass extinction, kind of our first of the big 5 recorded ones. So this is a point where we finally have a full plant fossil. And this full plant fossil is not a bryophyte like we would predict, like if we went through the series up to flowering plants. And that's interesting. It's actually a vascular plant, and this is kind of a fossil showing that. And something to draw your attention to is the scale bar of that plant. So this is a vascular plant, but it's only about 2 centimeters tall. And so it's kind of living the bryophyte life of being quite small, probably utilizing the boundary layer and stuff. So by the end of the Silurian, we start having a terrestrial revolution, and we start getting more and more things moving onto land. And so that kind of moves into the Devonian, which is interesting for a number of reasons. This is the period where we have some of the best fossil plant evidence, and that's from the Rinnie Chert, if you've heard of that, in Scotland. And so there's tons of diversity of plants. But there's no bryophytes represented, which is pretty strange. You would expect that if you have, it's from this around a salt marsh, presumed millions and millions and millions of years ago, that got fossilized, and it's weird that there's no bryophytes. We can already see evidence that there's arachnids on land, true insects, flightless insects, and freshwater crustaceans like fairy shrimp and stuff. Those are already around, but it was weird that there's no bryophytes. There's tons of plants that are all extinct, of course, but there's evidence of lycophytes, which is a lineage that's still around today. In other places, we have, from this period, we have liverwort fossils, and some of them look pretty close to groups that we see today, which is pretty interesting. This period, the Devonian, is also known as the Age of Fishes because things are going crazy with fish in the ocean. And at some point near the end, near the mid or end, that's when our vertebrate ancestor, so our ancestor, moves onto land. And then near the end is when forests start coming. And so the Carboniferous is when the period we really start thinking about forests. And it's called the Carboniferous, right, because of all the carbon you find from this time period. And that's because of these huge coal swamps of extinct plants, including lycophytes. So lycophytes, a group of plants we still have living today, but they're much smaller. They're mostly like trailing. They kind of look like little trees. But back in the Carboniferous, these were some of our first trees, and they were super common in wet places. And so in these wet places, you get all this packing of organic material, and it wouldn't decompose in time, and you get coal. So it was also quite a wet time. Arthropods, like they always are just exploding in diversity. We have a lot of amphibians now, and the first amniotes, so the things with amniotic fluid that will give rise to reptiles and mammals. That's happening at this point. There's not a lot of bryophyte fossils from the Carboniferous as well, which is interesting. We would think that by this point, they're super well represented, but not so much. There's still more liverwort fossils that we know about, and the first fossils of actual mosses that aren't those mysterious sphagnums are from this time point. So our first moss fossils, regardless of those ones previously, are coming at the time point wherein vertebrates are already on land. That doesn't mean that they have that was the order of things. That's just the evidence that we have. Anyways, at the end of the Carboniferous, things were changing quite a bit, and it's called this rainforest collapse, where we have this, as Pangaea starts forming, there's a lot of aridity in the internal continent, and things change. So the period after that, and the last period we're going to talk about is the Permian. And so this is when Pangaea is a thing, and we're still, of course, getting a lot more arthropods and more bug diversity. And from this period, we actually have this really, really well-documented group of extinct mosses. And so these are mosses that they're not related to any really, we don't have any descendants from this group alive today, completely extinct lineage, but they're so interesting and complicated. and really unique. And so they're called protosphagnalian mosses. And that chart on the left is showing some of their diversity. Super fascinating, but it's just a highlight of, okay, yeah, there was a huge diversity out there, and we lost a lot. On the right, those are fossils of ginkgo relatives. So at this point in the Permian, this is when we start seeing that, oh, the ginkgo lineage is distinct and starting its own thing. So super ancient lineage of plants as well, the ginkgos, and also the cycads are getting going here. After the Permian, we have the largest extinction event in recorded history. And after that, as things bounce back in the Triassic and Jurassic, that's what shapes a lot of our modern day flora and fauna. And then, you know, the glacial history that comes after. So I wanted to kind of go through that to highlight some things in that, one, that there's not a lot of fossil evidence to say that bryophytes colonized or diversified on the earth before the ancestors of vascular plants. And that actually would disagree with what we have in fossils, right? The oldest complete fossil we have is of the vascular plant lineage. So it's pretty interesting. It's likely that a lot of the major groups between bryophyte lineages are super old, but a lot of the modern day diversity happened fairly recently. And that's because there's a ton of extinction and then a ton of radiation when the world completely changed when flowering plants came onto the scene, right? Like almost all ecosystems are dominated by flowering plants. And so there's a whole suite of bryophytes that adapted to those habitats as well. Regarding fossil bryophytes, it is as hard as you might think. It's really time consuming and they're small, and you have to basically just take blind, tiny sections of rocks and look through them. But you can see a surprising amount of detail that will help them trace them in the kind of the evolutionary history. So you can do cross sections like on the right, where you're seeing less than a single cell thick sections that has been preserved for hundreds of millions of years. And that's wild. So there's also just not a lot of many people doing this. And so it's likely that there's going to be a lot more that we learn from fossil bryophytes than we know right now, which is kind of an exciting thing to me. But unfortunately, there's still not a lot of people doing it. The bottom diagram I have there this is kind of a famously incorrect diagram of evolution, right? This is the linear progression where it's like, it puts like man at the top and it's like the end point of evolution, right? And so that's kind of what we have with, I think, the problem with bryophytes and with plants as a whole, is that for too long we've thought about bryophytes as this progression until we get to flowering plants. And in that case, there are these ancestral plants that are simple and primitive, and they are not complicated. And so that's why they're restricted to being how they are and stuff. But that's not at all how evolution works, right? It's this branching, crazy tree. And it's not like one thing is a failed journey to become anything else. So I think that's kind of interesting of placing them not as primitive plants, and maybe something that isn't talked about as often. So bryophytes today got a huge diversity of them. There's some 20,000 species, but we're still describing things. Me included, are still describing species and stuff. And probably the major divisions in the groups probably established in the Paleozoic, so those time periods that I talked about, but most of the living species are from recent diversifications. This is a tree of mosses, and it's just showing you that there's a big diversity in form as you go down, but I want to highlight that 90% of our moss species alive belong to this one group, and that's called the Bryopsida, and they're united by their peristome features. But if we think about the diversity that that group represents and the other groups similar to it, we can put bryophytes into these categories, these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 broad categories. And one of the most amazing things I think about bryophytes and the place that we live is that BC and Alaska are the only places in the world where you can find representatives from all of these major and ancient lineages of moss, which is pretty amazing. Some of these plants, like Tacaccia, is only known to have 2 species in the world, and it's thought to be the oldest living genus of plants, which is pretty crazy. And sphagnum, it's a whole different thing in there. We can see that our polytrichums, those ones that I talked about previously with more complicated leaves and stems, those are in their whole other group down there. But anyways, just wanted to highlight that there's a huge, deep, fundamental diversity that was generated in the Paleozoic, and we can find evidence of that in BC, evidence from all of that's alive today. It's pretty amazing. So in liverworts, there's a huge diversity in body plan. These are kind of the main groups. We can class them in on the left. But once again, in BC, we can find representatives from all of them but one of the major lineages of liverwort. And that's also just something that amazes me, because in flowering plants and more recent plants, a lot of the diversity is like very localized and stuff. And like certain ancient groups, like also if you imagine certain gymnosperms, like conifers, they're only certain geographically very localized. But we have these really old groups that even if they're represented by 5 species around the world, those 5 species might be all around the world, which is anyways. So yeah, these are the main groups. So we can, yeah. Hornworts are definitely the least species-rich group of bryophyte, and there's probably in the world only under 250 species, and there's less than 10 in BC. They're mostly species-rich in the tropics, but kind of as you go south from BC, they'll start to be more common. Like in California, they're definitely more common. And there's only kind of 5 major groups that we recognize today. And yes, some of these are separated with spore color. How to explore the bio world. It's a very small world out there, but not always. You typically want to have some way to magnify things, and the kind of golden tool of any bryologist is a little hand lens. And so these are often used for, like, jewelers have them, or people interested in lichens or other small things. But this is an amazing tool to have. I usually keep it on a string around my neck with a whistle, so if I get lost or can't find the other person I'm with. But this is how you're able to like magnify, and so you can see leaf shapes and you can start to uncover all of the little shoots that are mixed together. The bottom left photo is showing you these blue things that you can only see in the cells with microscopy. And these are called oil bodies. And liverworts are the only organisms in the world that have this organelle called oil bodies in their cells. Super unique and interesting, but often by looking at the color and shape of that and the number, you can kind of help you with IDs of liverworts. Oftentimes you'll need to collect a little piece, right? Because you'll need to look at it under a microscope or be able to look at it at another later date. And so bryologists often have lots of little paper packets with them to just grab little bits here and there. And one of the wonderful things about bryophytes too is that because they're these kind of spreading mat organisms, you can pick up a little piece and most of it is still there and still alive, and it doesn't really harm it because they're all kind of little shoots woven together. Over time, you might start to build a collection and store them in shoe boxes like myself, build a herbarium, and so you can have a reference material of dried plants from over time. So the bryophyte version of pressing plants, like people do with flowers, is to keep them in little packets. So you'll often need to read a lot of books to figure out species and spend time at the microscope, but not always. There's totally decent field guides to go out and explore with just a camera or your hand lens, and you can learn a lot of the common and abundant local species. But like, hence the image on the right, you don't necessarily need to know what the mosses or whatever that bryophytes are that you're enjoying. You can just enjoy them. So if you haven't laid down in a bog recently, it's wonderful, especially if you have rain pants on. But mosses are some of the most texturally and I think aesthetic pleasing things. So just stop and look at them and you'll start to pick it up. So little bits about why explore the world. I think this one's a video. Oh yeah. But they're small and they live everywhere and it's kind of a treasure hunt. Like in this video on the left, they're just, oh, that's actually a very rare species in BC that's living in just this little crack on some soil in this big boulder in a forest. And so it's totally a fun little treasure hunt to try and find them and learn from the weird little specific places that they're living. And it's also fun to do with other people, like on the right. So my last thoughts that I'm going to leave you with, I think I may have gone over time here, but is some more reasons why I think it's important and maybe why you should get into the bryophyte world. And that spending time thinking about these small organisms that, you know, sometimes they're dormant for most of the year and then they're just ready to go for a few months or stuff like that. I think it's really important to think about the world from this smaller and slower perspective and think about, yeah, like all that green scum, that could be 5 different species that all have their own crazy complicated evolutionary histories and their own personal agency and ingenuity to come up with the answers that they have to these problems. It's amazing. And I think it'll help you thinking about mosses and bryophytes will help understand the intricacies of an ecosystem because bryophytes often they know they can tell the difference between small differences a lot better than us. So when we talk about lots of organisms, we talk about the habit or the site that they're living in. But with bryophytes, we often talk about the microsite or the microhabit. So like in a crevice between 2 boulders kind of thing, where it's if once you start to realize where like all the little different unique substrates are in an ecosystem, it can be quite wonderful, and you can see how complicated and um, how much richness there is in diversity as you kind of advance through the layers. So also we are living in quite a wonderful place for bryophytes in general. I mean, you can see that all like the major diversity is represented, but also in our coastal climate and stuff, the bryophytes just love it here. And so you can see them in huge exuberance and stuff. They're also just so beautiful, and there's a lot of mysteries with each species. We still don't know a lot about them. Yeah. And so they still also pose this fundamental question of like the evolution of land plants and where they fit in with that. And so they're always going to be interesting. I think I'll stop there with this lovely photo of Connocephalum, the plant I study as well. This is another species that doesn't have a name. But thank you so much. I'm sorry for taking up extra time. I think I did, but hopefully there's some questions if there's still folks around. Yeah, I'll stop sharing.
Connor, that was absolutely incredible. I've learned more than I ever thought I would on this topic. You know, I often see things stuck on trees, the substrate being the bark of a tree. At least now I have a little bit of knowledge with which to look at that. And I think more often that I notice mosses on rocks, I think more likely. The whole thing is the whole field is it's almost overwhelming, and I think you're extremely well positioned to make your name in this whole field, because we are in BC, as you say, where we seem to have very high numbers of moss. You're doing your master's right now. I'm sure you'll go on to do your PhD in something even more particular. So keep up the good work. We're really proud of you, and thank you for all of this. Huge. So there is one question. Several questions. Just a minute. Okay, just going back. Ah, are there good citizen science platforms where we can post observations or learn more about bryophytes?
Yeah, so like with most groups, the best one right now is probably iNaturalist. But it's still completely dependent on the users, right? So as I've sometimes look at things on iNaturalist from the local area and will annotate them. But there's a few other local people who will help and annotate. And so it's always just kind of dependent on if you have a local knowledge base that uses that platform as well. And so uh, I would say that the AI on iNaturalist can certainly lead you astray, but it is remarkably good for some of like the most recorded organisms and some of our common ones. So I would say it's not a bad starting off point. So if you look at it and you go with the recommendation it tells you, see if you can find other photos about of that plant or read about it in a book or a field guide or something and help confirm because it might get it right.
Yeah. Another question, what do you use equipment, I presume, to macro photograph the smaller bryophytes? What's your equipment?
To show you, it's just a small
Really?
camera. I think it's Olympic TG 6 or 7. I think TG stands for like tough guy or something like that. But basically, you can drop it, put it in water or anything like that. But it also has a really amazing microscope feature, and it can do a little photo stacking. And so I'm actually borrowing this camera from the UBC Herbarium.
But it creates digital photos, obviously. Yeah, yeah. And then you can store them wherever you want.
Yeah, so basically all the bryophyte photos in my presentation were taken with that camera.
Could you
Wow.
put the name of it in the chat?
Yeah.
The next question is, where can you buy one of these little microscopes to look at mosses in the forest? So I think the word is a loop, right? L-O-U.
Yeah, a hand lens or a loop or yeah, a glass like that. There's tons of places online to get them. A lot of them are pretty good. Some recommendations would be I wouldn't get one that's in like the too low of price range, but you also don't need to get them in the very expensive price range. Kind of like 20 to 50 bucks is probably pretty good for a hand lens. Some things to look out for is they come in different magnifications. So it'll say like 10x, 12x, or 20x. There's differences between them, right? Like 20x is you'll be able to see a lot more detail, but the field of view is a lot smaller and the focus point, right? So you have to have it like really close and you can't see much with low light. And so most people prefer like a general 10 to 12x loop, and that lets you see kind of at a moderate distance in most lighting.
Mhm. Is there a particular time of year that they make the sporophytes?
Oh, yeah. Interesting question. So totally, just like flowering plants, they each have their own, like lots of different species are on different schedules. Lots of different bryophytes are on different schedules. One of the more common ones I would say would be to start developing a sporophyte. So fertilization happens in the spring or the summer, and then it starts developing over the fall, and then it overwinters and releases spores in the spring. That's probably the most common, but there's a lot of very species specific variation in that. Yeah.
Hmm. Sorry, there might be more just going
No
down.
worries.
Yes, you just said you were an iNaturalist specialist, so you help ID moss and liverwort photos, yes.
Mhm.
Are bryophytes good at telling us anything about climate change?
Oh, interesting. I there's I mean there's possibilities for sure. There's a lot of bryophytes are really common and specialized to harsh alpine conditions. and stuff like that. So there's bryophytes that, as the glaciers ebb and flow, there's like this crusty disturbance, right? It kind of grinds things up. There's early colonists on there, and then there's also bryophytes that grow in places where, say, there's really late snowpack, and so they only have like a month out of the year of growth or something like that. And so I think if we properly monitor a lot of these species that have these super specific ecologies, we'll be able to tell big changes and things in time, but it's hard to say.
I guess there's so much unknown about bryophytes that
Yeah,
we're going to lose a lot before we ever know about them.
yeah, something similar that we can tell a little bit more directly with bryophytes and lichens as well is air quality. And so you can use bryophytes and lichens really well as indicators of air pollution, and kind of you can measure how much they've taken up, but you can also kind of use the species assemblages to kind of tell you like if the air is too toxic, basically.
Mm.
Interesting.
Is there a good field guide for learning to ID bryophytes, the local ones?
The local ones. Well, yes and no. There's a book called Common Mosses of Some Common Mosses of British Columbia, which is a book by the late Wilf Schofield. But unfortunately, I don't know if that book is still in print anymore. Um, there's a book, I don't have it, but I've read it, I think it might just be called Mosses of the Pacific Northwest, but it's quite a good book as well. So if you can find, yeah, I can buy it used, but expensive. So I wouldn't try and, that the book that's out of print, it's specific to BC, but it's also not the most updated, and it's totally helpful, but it's not going to be as helpful as a book with lots of pictures, I think. So Mosses of the Pacific Northwest, I think, is a recent book that came out. I mean, I wrote
Yeah, go ahead.
in undergrad, I wrote a guide to all of the like all the bryophytes of Burnaby. But I don't so if you send me an email, I can send you a link to it. It's just like a couple gigabyte like file, so it's kind of hard to share. But yeah, so that would actually give you species pages for like 130 or so local species.
I'm just looking at my copy of Pojar and McKinnon.
Yeah,
Yeah, because that's got about 4 pages of sorry, I've got
yeah.
never mind. Anyway, Pojar and McKinnon, Plants of Coastal BC. It's got a few pages of mosses and liverwort.
Yes, if you have that book, definitely go try and learn the mosses that are in that book.
Yeah.
They're a good source if you want to, especially for, it is the free British Columbia Wildflowers app, which includes not just wildflowers, but also mosses and lichens and seaweeds. It has about 380 different bryophytes, plus 13 mosses or something. And the information about that is on the botany page of the Nature Vancouver website. And you can do restrictions by area to reduce it a bit. The difficulty that I find with this kind of an online app like this is it's only got like one photo in most cases for each moss, and it doesn't, unlike a book which might tell you, oh, this is similar to this, it doesn't distinguish. Each one is an entry that isn't kind of linked to the other entries, and so you could be looking at something that's super super rare or something that's super super common, and you wouldn't necessarily know. But it is a great, easy to carry, free source with a lot of pictures, and certainly, if you're learning just kind of local common mosses and liverworts, it's a great app to have.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Agree.
Sarah says, can I send you a photo of a very interesting moss, within quotes, that looks like a creeping pine tree?
Oh yeah,
So
totally.
are you willing to share your email, is the question.
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
Okay.
I'll type it.
Do any other living things depend on bryophytes for their own survival?
Yes, so much. If you're thinking about the forest landscape, it's covered in surfaces, right? And a lot of those surfaces are colonized by bryophytes, and they're just adding like a whole depth of habitat, basically. And so tons and tons of arthropods, like insects and other invertebrates, will house or lay their eggs in bryophytes. And so a lot of small animals do use them and use them as homes. They're helpful for also like fungi. If you're imagining a big decaying log, they're creating a nice blanket over top, and so they kind of have this feedback where they keep everything nice and moist a little bit more. And so that speeds up the fungal decay of the log itself, which releases CO2 into the boundary layer of the log, which then the bryophyte can use. So it's a nice little system there. A lot of birds also like will take mosses and weave them in their nests and stuff. I watch crows pick mosses and stuff. I'm not totally sure if they're always using them for their nests or they're just kind of playing around with them, but never know with crows. They're kind of mischievous little guys. Um, but yeah, so they're totally really important to a lot of different groups.
Excellent. The questions are so interesting. Mosses used to be considered a terminal species because they make the soil acidic. Is this true of all mosses?
No, so this is probably comes from what we know about sphagnum mosses. And so sphagnum mosses, these are the bog mosses, and kind of their strategy, one of their strategies is they'll initially colonize, say, like a pool of water or a depression where water comes in, and over time, they're really good at pumping out protons and like acidifying their environment. And so they'll do that, and it'll kind of push out a lot of other things that can't tolerate that acidity. And over time, they create this entirely unique ecosystem where it's this really acidic bog. And so a lot of things that grow there are specialized to grow there. But it's largely because the sphagnum is creating habitat for itself. But yes, that's not shared with all bryophytes. And, a lot of bryophytes specialize on like living on limestone only or things like that.
So different people have asked you to do things, but it's probably the best if people contact you, Connor.
If you have sent
Wardrop.
the request to me in the chat, if you could screenshot my email and just send it to my email, that would be great.
Yes. I'd make a specific question. I think I've reached the bottom. I haven't read out all the praise. There's lots of praise and thank yous and so on.
I do have one question. Who lives on mosses? Does anybody eat mosses?
I mean, insects?
Yeah, good question. It's kind of weird how little things eat mosses and how we like mosses seem to be either not worth it for the calories, like to consume them, and they're not worth it, or they're really well defended. The case with liverworts is probably that they're very well chemically defended, and so they're not palatable to most things. And so liverworts, they have those oil bodies in their cells, and they often produce a whole range of really complicated smelly and other compounds, terpenoids and stuff like that. So yeah, it's pretty interesting, I think.
Have you decided or thought about what the purpose of the smell of the conocephalums is? Connocephala?
Yeah, I think it's probably against herbivores, like anti-herbivory. If they bite into it and they just get this spray of like aromatic, pungent smell. It's I think it smells great. But yeah, Connocephalum, it's we know so it's probably our largest thalloid liverwort. So the plants can be about this big, which is pretty big for thalloid liverworts. And in not so much here documented, but in Japan and the East Coast, there's certain groups of flies that if you've heard of leaf miners, you'll see like those patterns on leaves where it's like larvae crawling through, kind of eating. Connocephalum seems to have flies that are specific to it as well, and so it's actually the only host for these various species of, I think it's a crane fly and a type of moth, maybe? No, that doesn't sound right. It's definitely a crane fly and something else.
Very good.
Mhm.
Well, we shall look forward to when there will be Connocephalum wardropii.
Yes, we'll see.
Anyway, all sorts of thanks. Thank you, Connor. This gave me new information on mosses. Thank you, Connor. Beautiful presentation. Not enough on moss going on. We look forward to hearing your name closely connected with mosses from now on. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. All right. So yeah, it's great to meet you all. Hopefully I'll answer your emails this evening or tomorrow. Maybe no promises on this evening, but definitely tomorrow.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Take care.
Yeah, it's great to meet you all.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye now.